Conference called Elevate, but from 6 to 9 Saturday night. So anyway. Good evening, Grace Church family, and those of you watching on the social media platforms. Good to have you. As we always say, I keep looking this way because I'm used to looking that way on Sunday mornings. I think it's here. But anyway, if you're new and you want the notes, we have notes on these sessions every Wednesday night. Just email our office at gcotv.org. That's office@gcotv. Take number 3. Don't try this at home. I'm a professional at this. Office@gcotv.org. We will get the notes to you if you want them. And I noticed there are a couple of errors, as there are every week. These rarely, unfortunately, get proofed. I'm always running late to get them, and I bounce them over here and they copy them, and that's it. So if it doesn't catch it on spell check, which sometimes it doesn't, of course, as you all know that. So we've got a couple of those errors. Anyway, here we go. At Session 7 on the founding, faith in the founding, the Bible and the Constitution. While we've been dealing with history over all these sessions, tonight is really going to be a history lesson. Don't look at the amount of pages and go, oh my God, are you going to be able to get this done before 8:30. We will, because much of this we're not going to simply just read, because you can read that yourself. As it relates to some of the framers that we're going to look at tonight, there were 55 signers. We've talked about that at great length of the Constitution. And while all of them played a crucial role, there were some that were they emerged themselves as probably more significant in terms of the contributors. Some of these you're going to know. You're going to know George Washington and Adams, but there are others here that you probably haven't heard of, like Gouverneur Morris. That one looks like it's misspelled because you think it's governor when we get to Gouverneur, but that's his name, Gouverneur, not governor. It's not Governor Morris. So I give you a heads up there. That one's not misspelled. So you know Washington, you probably don't know Robert Morris, you don't know a couple of these others. So here we go, Washington. We'll go through this real quick. He was elected unanimously as president of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Let me just say this about Washington. He refused to do it, but Washington could have been king. Seriously. Now he didn't. He said, no, been there, done that. All of us who came over, but he could have done that. He could have been the first king of these United States. He refused to do it. They essentially forced him into the presidency. He really didn't want to do that either. So he becomes the president of the Constitutional Convention in 1787. Of course, the great Revolutionary War leader. He was an advocate of separation from England. He wanted a clear outline from the colonies of their own ideas of how things ought to work and so on. He encouraged the governors of each state to send a delegate to this special meeting. We'll talk more about that as we get into this a little further tonight. Under some form of charter is what he was looking for, so he was a major proponent of that. It's interesting, as the president of the convention, when they convened in 1787, he couldn't debate himself. He has to monitor it, so he couldn't inject anything himself. So as it says here, he'd head to the pubs, which think now British, and of course Victoria will know this from England. When we think pubs, we think of the bar itself, but these would have been certain places where you could get liquor, but there was also a hotel there. Yeah. That's what they considered. So Washington would go after the meetings that day and try to convince the various delegates about given positions, even though he couldn't do anything on the floor of the convention. Washington's faith was rarely expressed so boldly outside, but it was clear his foundation. He often referred to God in his letters and public speeches as providence. James Wilson, that may be the second one we have listed there, not as familiar. He was a strong believer in central government, spoke on fervor for it. He signed the Declaration of Independence in 1775. Watch this now. His real cue, he at that point in time broke a deadlock of the Pennsylvania delegation. They were deadlocked. We'll talk, especially as it regards the Constitution, in those 100 or so days that they were locked up in Philadelphia, as to how all that went. He was ranked as the second most influential member of the convention behind James Madison. See, most of us don't know that name. We maybe know James Madison, but we don't know this gentleman by the name of James Wilson. Wilson was an Episcopalian. You're going to find that the majority of these were Episcopalian or Congregationalist. He later became a Presbyterian. He was known as a devout Christian. John Adams, lawyer, statesman, diplomat from Massachusetts, became a leader in the American Revolution, helped draft the Declaration of Independence in 1774. He became the first vice president of the United States and later became the second president of the United States. He was raised a Congregationalist. He had a strong faith in God, encouraging his fellow Americans to ask God for favor. Here's another one. This next one you may not be familiar with is Charles Pinckney. He was a former governor of South Carolina, and at age 29 was the youngest of those at the convention, the youngest, one of the signers. He was the youngest delegate and signer of the Constitution. He presented, even at that young age, the Pinckney Plan. There were, understand these men were convened from May the 25th until September. They were confined to, you've all seen the pictures of, the drawing of pictures, the drawing, rendering of the final with the signing. Those 55 delegates were in a closed room with no doors and no windows. The primary reason is they did not want any leaking to happen. They did not want something to go out, be misconstrued by the people, and then maybe sway it. Because remember, once this Constitution was signed, that didn't mean it was a done deal. It had to be ratified from a legal standpoint, had to be ratified by 9 of the 13 states. So they didn't want anything getting wonky here in terms of what people thought was happening. So they had a code of silence, and there was no, think about that. You had 55 men in the middle of summer in Philadelphia in a room, in a box, hammering this out. But Pinckney, again, was South Carolina. One of the Pinckney Plan and the Virginia Plan got coalesced into with some, and we'll talk more about that, I think, next week. We won't get into that this week, but South Carolina was one that you had southern states, but you had 3 that were primarily, or strongly, I shouldn't say primarily, strongly slave states: Georgia and the 2 Carolinas. So there is this back and forth about, well, why didn't certain things happen? Why were not the slaves released at the signing of the Constitution and the ratification of it by the states? Well, understand that they were trying to hold this thing together. This was not some simple task these men were trying to hammer out. And it was apparent that the southern states, specifically Georgia and the Carolinas, were not going to go. They were not, and Pinckney, while one of his plans was considered, not so much from a standpoint of what they were going to do there as to how they were going to look. I think in Pinckney's plan, you also had states that were concerned because they were small. They thought they were going to be ousted. As a matter of fact, were you aware, I think I've got it in your notes tonight, Rhode Island never sent a delegate to the convention, the Constitutional Convention. So there were only 12 states actually at the Constitutional Convention. They never sent a delegate. The reason being they thought they was too small and they'd be overlooked anyway. So anyway, I'm jumping ahead of myself. But I think Pinckney's plan had Congress, that branch would be voted on based, their initial view was based on how much taxation, which would mean certainly on how much of your population. And then the Senate would be elected by state legislators. Of course, that didn't happen that way. Then there was the Virginia plan, and we'll not get in the weeds on that. But finally, they coalesced around, yes, you will have so many representatives based on the size of your state, but everybody will have 2 senators elected by the people. That was not the initial. That wasn't Pinckney's plan. It wasn't the Virginia plan. It finally came out of a combination of the 2 of them. If you're playing a parlor game hope you remember that, and you can win that parlor contest. He also was an Episcopalian by affiliation, a strong supporter of the separation of church and state. In general, he believed that guaranteeing religious freedom. He presented the proposal that the legislature of the United States shall pass no law on the subject of religion. That came from this man named Pinckney. It was apparently dropped at the time, but reappeared in the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights. So even in the process of the Constitution, they killed it, or at least dropped it. I said killed it, maybe too strong a word. Here we are. This is Gouverneur. Again, that's not misspelled. It's not Governor Morris. His name was Gouverneur, okay? He was considered one of the most important and vocal participants in the 1787 convention. He argued for granting veto powers to the Congress over state laws and proportional representation of the Congress based on taxation, which in effect we ended up with, but not on taxation, but population of your state. So when you see them, the so-called gerrymandering, where they start changing the lines of congressional districts, whoever gets in power in the state house, we're going to change those, and then the other side screams bloody murder because they're padding it for their side. Everybody get this? They are padding it for their side. Republicans and Democrats. So that happens on both sides of the ledger. But based on representation, again, for them initially it was taxation. He organized the writing of the Constitution. Watch that. He organized the writing of it. This guy was very, very important in the Constitution, even though probably most of us have never heard about him. He worked towards language clarification. He was an Episcopalian by affiliation, believed that God gives every man the right to liberty, and felt strongly that morality had to be taught through religion, as we talked about in the early weeks. They didn't believe you could have morality just simply because you tried harder. If the only way that was going to come about was through religious stance. Franklin, we all know Franklin, printer, writer, inventor, scientist, best known for his experiments with electricity. As the oldest of the founding fathers, he was respected and wielded great influence. He was considered the father of the Constitution. He was the only member to, watch this now, to have signed 3 of the documents: the Declaration of Independence, the Treaty with Britain, and the Constitution. Now, we're going to look at a man in a minute that was the only man to sign all 4 of the central documents. We'll get to him in a second. Franklin, as well as Jefferson, their ones and a couple of others are the most pointed to as to their deist stance or their non-committal to Christ stance. But watch this. In a letter he wrote to Ezra Stiles, who was then the president of Yale College before it's Yale University, he wrote, "Here is my creed." This is Franklin. "I believe in one God, creator of the universe, that he governs it by his providence." That, I think, would do until you actually became maybe a believer. I don't know. James Madison. He was co-author of the influential Federalist Papers, writing over 15 of them, which was recognizing the weakness of the Articles of Confederation. He initiated a meeting in Annapolis, Maryland in 1786 to address the concerns. We'll get into the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation in just a second. He was known for his copious notes. You had 2 or 3 of these men who just, thank God for them, because they recounted things when there's no vocal, there's no tape recorder, but they had copious notes. Adams was one of those. And attention to detail. He created the foundation for the Bill of Rights, and because of his pivotal role in drafting the Constitution, he is hailed as the father of the Constitution. He later became the 4th President of the United States. He was outspoken in his stance on Christian beliefs and his convictions. As an example, that he encouraged his friend William Bradford to be sure of his own relationship with God. So he writes to his friend Bradford and said, you better be sure. You better not be hoping that it's right and hoping you're in right relationship. Thomas Paine, how many of you heard of Thomas Paine? He is remembered as the strong advocate of separation from the British monarchy. His views were expressed in his publication called Common Sense. That was a pamphlet that he published, had wide circulation at the time. Because of his influence, especially in writing, he's referred to as the father of the American Revolution. Watch this now. Although he wrote most of the successful publications, he never accepted any compensation for any of them, including, of course, the biggest one being Common Sense that had widespread circulation. Paine, though, was one that while he was a firebrand of the revolution, and some again label him as the father of the revolution, there's little written about his personal relationship with God, as different from some of the others, many of the others. But given the fact that the faith of the founding fathers was largely Christianity, and that's undeniable, hopefully we've driven that home strong enough over the course of these 6 weeks prior to tonight, and that would include, likely would have included Thomas Paine. Here's again, another one of the unique figures. Roger Sherman, drafter and signer of the Declaration, is the only man in all of these that was the signer of all 4. Well, first of all, I'm jumping ahead. Signer of the Declaration of Independence, helped draw up the Articles of Confederation. He was the only member to have signed all 4 of our nation's significant documents: the Continental Association from the Continental Congress, the Declaration of Independence, the Article of Confederation, and the U.S. Constitution. Roger Sherman is the only one of the founders that has that designation. Not Adams, not Madison, not Washington. He signed all 4 of the central documents in our early history. He held reverence for the Bible and studied it with deep attention. He was intensely acquainted with the doctrine of the gospel. His dedication to Christ as a young person continued and expressed in all of his public service. Robert Morris, here's another one that we are likely not as familiar with. That's not the preacher from Dallas, although he's a good one. Could be his great-great-grandfather. Might be. He was considered by many to be next. Watch this. He was considered by many to be next to George Washington, the most powerful man in America. How many of us have heard of Robert Morris, especially in that capacity? He had a profound understanding of finances and became the master financier of the Revolution and the early Republic. He was responsible for the establishment of the Bank of the United States. He signed all 3 of the principal documents: the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the Constitution. But watch this now. He died in the poorhouse, having given all his money to the war. Wow. When we stop to consider the sacrifice that many of these men gave. Here's one, Morris, who was evidently brilliant in terms of numbers. He becomes the financier of the Revolution, helped start the Bank of the United States, but yet ends up in the poorhouse because he'd given all of his money to the war. It was Franklin who said, when they continued to push this forward, he said, "Gentlemen, we will all hang together, or we're all going to hang separately," meaning at the end of a rope. So if we just view this as some powerful, intellectual, politically skewed men just decided they were going to do something, we miss. These guys were sacrificing, in this case with Morris, his entire wealth. But they knew when they launched forward in this that if this did not go well, King George would have them at the end of a rope. So his faith was he was a constant worshiper and supporter of the American church. Jefferson, of course, we're familiar with Jefferson, principal author of the Declaration of Independence. He was the nation's first Secretary of the State. As we'll look here at the end, when we think of the signers, we would have supposed Jefferson was one of the signers of the Constitution. He was not. The reason he was not, because he was in France as the secretary from the United States. Neither was Adams. John Adams, a signer of the Constitution, because he was in Great Britain at the time of the signing, although they were, of course, made aware of what was going on. But we think, well, the signers, it's got to be Adams, it's got to be Jefferson, but neither one of them signed the Constitution. Although he's not present at the signing of the Constitution, he had profound influence in the creation of the document. Again, he was, in terms of the Declaration of Independence, he was the primary driver of that. Now, again, Jefferson is always the one pointed to as the poster child, as it were, of deism, irreligious, because of what they believed Jefferson did and stood for and didn't say and so on. But he believed Christianity to be the highest expression of faith. He took a public stand for religious freedom by drafting a Virginia resolution calling for a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer as the British ships blockaded Boston's harbor. Historians record numerous expressions of his faith in a sovereign God. It just does not appear that he believed that Jesus Christ was necessarily the living Son of God and so forth. But anyway, thank God for what Jefferson did and helped drive forward. Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton. As a staff aide to General Washington, he became an influential promoter and interpreter of the Constitution. He was a founder of the Federalist Party, the nation's financial system, and the first Secretary of the Treasury. He is credited with authorship of over 50 of the Federalist Papers. Now, how many have heard of, well, it's not just in recent times, but it has come to the forefront in the recent times again, certainly since President Trump has been president, of the Federalist Society. The Federalist Society is they're hardcore constitutionalists. They derive their origin from here with the Federalist, Hamilton, John Jay, and Madison. We'll talk about them more in a minute. But the Federalist Papers is a collection of 85 articles or essays written by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay. They did it under a collective pseudonym called Publius to promote the ratification of the United States Constitution. The collection was commonly known as the Federalist until the name the Federalist Papers emerged in the 20th century. So let me back up a second. They have signed the Constitution, but it doesn't mean the Constitution is the law of the land yet. It had to be ratified by each of the, well, it didn't have to be ratified by each of the states. It could have passed with the ratification of 9 of the 13 states. So it went back to the state legislators, the Constitution did, after these 55 signers had worked for 100 days to hammer this out. And by the way, I have to say I was not aware of this until, again, doing this research. It was my assumption that they went into the Constitutional Convention with a full intent that they're going to have drafted something that will form this new government. But in their initial gathering, it was just to correct errors in the Articles of Confederation. So it wasn't that they went in when they convened, here's what we're going to do. Well, the history has said that evolved over those 100 days. That initially there was massive weakness in the Articles of Confederation. That was kind of their first volley of trying to figure out what we're going to do as these colonies and how we're going to stand and so on. Had errors in it. We'll talk about some of those in a minute. But out of that then comes the Constitution and this absolutely new form of government. That's not what they went in initially to do. Interesting. So it comes out of the Constitutional Convention. It has to go back to the states, these 13 states. They've got to ratify 9 of the 14, or otherwise all the work done by these men goes by the wayside or goes back to them to do whatever revisions. So Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay became the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. What they were attempting to do with these Federalist Papers was to certainly convince any and all of the states, but primarily New York, what the Federalist Papers are. There are 85 of them, are essays. They didn't become called the Federalist Papers until the 20th century. These essays were trying to convince the states this is what the Constitution means. So literally, these three men took every line of the Constitution and said, here's what we meant. That's why the Federalist Society is so passionate about constitutional lawyers and ultimately constitutional Supreme Court justices. They supplied President Trump with, I think, somewhere north of 50 of their belief that these were firm constitutional believers. So you can pick from these, which he did. Gorsuch and Kavanaugh came off of the list from the Federalist Society. Everybody with me? Don't. I want you to get confused with the Federalist Society. That's present tense. These Federalist essays were written by these three men, 85 of them. They went line by line through the Constitution and said, here's what we meant, so you all understand this. The Federalist Papers are really, really important because they tell us, at least in the mind of Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, James Madison, this is what we meant. This is what we meant by what we said here in the Constitution. This is what it meant. So again, when I just said, when the liberal folks say it's an evolving document, it's changing all the time because of the culture and the time and the age and so on, that's not what Jay and Madison and Alexander Hamilton believe. That's why over a span of years they wrote these essays trying to, again, help the states understand so that they would ratify it. Everybody with me? Yep. So, just for another, again, the parlor games, that they wanted the Gouverneur Morris to be a part of that as well, too, that we read about earlier. Morris declined. He said, I don't want to do that. There was a fifth one. Now his name escapes me. Started with a D. I think John Jay wanted him, and either Hamilton or Madison said, no, I don't want him. So as a history buff, I found that out today. Or sometime over the course of last week. He actually wrote 2 or 3 himself. They just never got to be part of the Federalist essays. Is everybody clear on that? It was their goal to explain what the framers meant by every line of the Constitution. That's what these Federalist essays. So you say Federalist number 10, Federalist number 14, Federalist number 50. These were specific essays written by these three men to explain a given point of the Constitution.
So are these papers with the Constitution now? Like, are they still?
No, they weren't. They didn't become a part of the Constitution.
Yeah, but like the papers that you're talking about.
Oh, you
still around?
Oh, sure. You can. Yeah, you can Google list. Google list.
You can Google list them.
You can Google list them, and then you'd come up with the Federalist Papers. Yeah.
And they're all in public domain.
And all in public. Yeah, that's because they're all. They didn't become a part of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights.
No, I didn't. I just said
Okay.
they were with them where they are right now, like in a locked location.
They're public display, I assume, in Philadelphia as well too. I'm sure as well as other places. But you can download those and see them. It is out of the Federalist stance of which we now have the Federalist Society, which they are absolutely vehemently constitutional lawyers. And they catch a lot of feedback because the left not only does not like them, they abhor them. They think they're stuck in another century. I'm being kind there. They think less of them than that, but that's another story. His faith, the pronouncement of his faith appears in several of his quotes, but most notably, as he neared death, he is said to have remarked, I have a tender reliance on the mercy of Almighty God through the merits of the Lord Jesus Christ. The problems and promises, Washington having just retired from the Continental Army, and he wanted to retire. He wanted to go back to the farm. I'm done. I've served The nation helped him get through this and win the war. Thank you, but I'm done here. But he wanted a formal charter then when they elected him as unanimously as the president of the convention. He wanted a formal charter to be established to clearly state the position of the colonies. He encouraged the governor of every state to send a delegate to a special meeting to consider organizing the states under some type of formal charter. Madison of Virginia, Alexander of Hamilton of New York, and the others wrote letters to Congress urging them to call a convention of the delegates from each state. By that point in time, each state had already written their own constitution. 74 delegates from 12 states were appointed to the Constitution Convention in Philadelphia. As I mentioned earlier, Rhode Island just simply declined. They were the smallest of the 13 states, and they refused to participate. They assumed that being that small, they would have no voice. So they didn't even show up. So if you're in Rhode Island, there's no sense you can whine now because your founding fathers didn't even show up. It was scheduled to begin, as I mentioned, on May 4th, 1787, but bad weather, it was necessary for it to be moved to May 25th. Understand, these guys couldn't hop on a train. They couldn't get on the interstate. They were going to have to go through bad roads and muddy conditions and so on. So 74 delegates had been appointed by the states, but in the end, only 55 participated. So there's another point if you're part of a game somewhere that the number was higher. 74 was the actual number that were supposed to show up, and only 55 did participate. Why was that? Well, many of the states didn't provide them any money. So they said to the delegates, "You're on your own, bucko. Pay your own way." Now, we wouldn't think about that day, would we? Be a congressman or woman for 2 years and have an income for life. That was another thing they never, ever, they didn't, part of their plans initially were that, especially in regards to senators, that they would need to be well-off individuals because they were not going to be paid and you were not going to stay there long. My, how that's changed. So they didn't give them travel or expense money. So that accounted for much of the fact that they didn't show up. James Madison, the esteemed James Madison, had to borrow money for his living expenses before the convention was over. The one who's one of the writers of the Federalist Papers didn't have enough money to stay at the convention and had to borrow money. These men, ladies and gentlemen, sacrificed an awful lot for us to have what we seem to be so cavalier about not protecting. So Congress had indicated previously that the convention was for the sole and express purpose of revisiting the Articles of Confederation. As I said earlier, I thought they went in the intent that we're going to come out of here with some kind of a constitution, and we're going to form this new republic that we have in our mind. Well, that was not their initial gathering. It was to fix the Articles of Confederation, which had immense weaknesses, and we'll talk about those in a second. Little did they know that before it was over, the convocation of delegates would come up with a whole new system of government under a completely unique constitution. That was not their intent when those 55 men gathered in Philadelphia. All of them pledged secrecy. I mentioned that earlier. People were curious and gathered outside the hall, but were not allowed entrance. Washington, as the president of the Constitution, presided as moderator, and Madison, as well as others like Adams, kept records over not Adams, he was never over the proceedings. From May the 25th through September 1787, they discussed and argued. And they argued. Again, you had southern states like Georgia and the Carolinas. You had northern states like Massachusetts and New York that had altogether differing ideas of how this ought to look. It is, I think we cannot forget or even minimize the importance of the providence of God on these men, because they didn't come into this gathering, these 55, all singing Kumbaya and saying, we're all together here and cut from England, and we're going to form this new nation under a new constitution and a democratic republic. They had severe differences. But, as we'll look at in a second, Franklin, who's supposed to be this non-religious guy, would say, we're going to pray. And before this gets done, we're going to come together. That would be a novel thought in Washington now. We have all these differences, but somehow we're going to push through those things and get some things done. A lot of speeches were made. Think about this. When you're talking about essentially 100 days of gathering, different points of view. There was not only a thorough discussion of the important issues, but willingness to make compromises so an agreement could ultimately be reached. The framers had seen the weaknesses in the Articles of Confederation. Let's look at those. This is not in your notes. I should have done that and got going too fast and didn't. Let me, if you want to jot these down. This is not extensive because we could spend the rest of the night on the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, but let's just highlight a few bullet points real quick. Under the Articles of the Confederation, the Congress had no power to coin money. Each of the states produced their own money, developed its own currency. It was one of the weaknesses that almost cost them a revolution, among others in the weakness of the Articles of Confederation, but they didn't have a central. That's why you hear all the stories about Washington's men were without boots in the winter and bloody feet and so on. There were no funds coming to them. There was no central Washington, D.C. or state headquarters that was sending money to them. Listen, much of the revolution, as you saw from the one gentleman, was privately funded. Men expended their estates to fight this war. So Congress had no power to coin money, therefore each state developed its own currency. That was a weakness. Congress was unable to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. So foreign nations said, hey, we don't know we want to do business with you individual states. So we're going to cut a contract with Pennsylvania and how you're going to pay us. So there was immense weakness then in terms of trade because they're not, the trading partners would not be dealing with a nation, they're dealing with individual states. Huge weakness in the Confederation, Articles of Confederation. Some states refused to pay for goods they purchased from abroad. They said, thanks, but come and get us, I guess. I don't know. Sue us. Yep. Send a collection agency to the state of New Hampshire, whatever. Congress was unable to impose taxes at that point under the Articles of the Confederation. It could only borrow money on credit. Again, where are they getting the money to fight the war against Great Britain? They're going to borrow the money. Here's another one. No national court system was established to protect the rights of the U.S. citizens. There's no needless to say, no Supreme Court at that juncture. No executive branch that was established to enforce laws. Another one. No executive branch was established to enforce laws. Amendments could be added only with the approval of all 13 states. So if an amendment was raised, if it was not ratified by all 13 of the states, it was shot down. Approval of 9 of the 13 states was required to pass a law in Congress, which again, that was once the Constitution was signed, all they needed was 9 of the 13 states to ratify it. But one vote was allotted for each state despite the size of the population. They didn't think that was right. What was right in terms of equitable distribution among more populous states and so on. Here's what Noah Webster, somewhere around 1780, said about the Articles of Confederation. He said it was just a firm league of friendship, so long as any individual state has power to defeat the measure of the other 12, what's it say? He said, our pretended union is but a name and our confederation a cobweb. Let me read that again. I'm sorry, I should have got this in your notes and got going too fast and didn't. Noah Webster said it is just a firm league of friendship, so long as any individual state has power to defeat the measure of the other 12, which they did, because remember, all 13 had to sign off. Our pretended union is but a name, and our confederation nothing but a cobweb. Again, the inability for them to coin currency as a government, it was done by the individual states, and other things almost cost the loss of the war. And witnessed the failings of many European governments in that day. The desire was that this new country would succeed, and that was their determined goal. Here's some founders again who were not present. I've already mentioned those again. Jefferson, who was in France, Adams, who was serving the U.S. Minister to Great Britain at the time. There were other founding fathers, Richard Henry, Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, John Hancock. There's another one we think, John Hancock. Sign your John Hancock. Therefore, he didn't sign the Constitution. He wasn't there. So, however, they were kept apprised of what was going on, so they were aware of it, certainly. Again, these men are considered founders. David Barton, I think, considers some 250, I think, I may be wrong on that he would broadly count as founders, and then you have the framers, those 55 who actually signed the Constitution and did the work of those 100 days in hammering it out. The preamble. By July the 26th, the principal issues had been sufficiently settled to put the Constitution in a rough form. There was a committee on detail appointed. Did you know that? A committee on detail. That was to make sure what we've hammered out here, we get down correctly. Committee on detail was appointed with instructions to have the report completed by August the 6th. It was decided the opening words of the Constitution should spell out the reasons for it and the intent of the law. By September, there were still many details to be refined, and the amended rough draft was then submitted to the Committee on Style. Did you know there was this Committee on Detail and there was a Committee on Style for the final rewrite? Here we see Gouverneur, again, not Governor, Gouverneur Morris, delegate from Pennsylvania, who was the skilled lawyer and perhaps the best writer, was designated to do the rewrite. So there's again another parlor game, if you're playing one of those games, who actually did the final rewrite of the Constitution. It was not Jefferson, it was not John Hancock, it was not John Adams, they weren't even there. It was Gouverneur Morris. He not only wrote the preamble, but organized the entire Constitution as it now existed. That man in the final rewrite with the style team, I guess. A significant and incredible accomplishment. So the rewriting done by the committee resulted in the preamble we know today. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. That's how it all begins. Here's some, again, key points, and these are some that we've talked about, at least some of these in previous sessions. To say that the debates were heated would have been an understatement. There were certainly times in those 100 days in which I'm reasonably convinced historically that they thought this wasn't going to work. Let's cash this in. It's not going to work. We're too severed in what this state wants, what this state believes, what this one does not want, and so on. Did you know that it was finally, again, the give or take in terms of, for instance, population and how they would be, how many delegates you would get then, and then taxation, that finally the northern one said, you will have to count your slaves. and a slave was 3/5 of a person. But had to be counted for the taxation base. That's what the North wants. If you're going to hold us to this, you're not going to come along with us, Georgia and the Carolinas, then here's what we want. They didn't want them included because those were chattel to them anyway, ownership.
Yep.
But the North says, no. If we're going to give on this in order for this to finally come together, then you must count them for a taxation standpoint. So you'll find that historically they were counted as 3/5 of a person, not a full person. And they continued to bring slaves in. It was supposed to end initially at 1800. Georgia fought on that to 1808, and 40,000 more were brought over that 8-year period. But listen, Jefferson didn't want that. Washington didn't want that. But again, they said, well, why didn't they fight it? Because they knew we're fragile at this juncture. Now, what they didn't want to happen, they thought would hold together, certainly does fracture. It fractures 70 years later. But they knew at that juncture, either we're all going to get this done somehow, some way, or we're not going to get it done, and we're in an immense amount of trouble. There will be no Constitution. There will be no United States of America. So I know there's a lot of screaming about why these men didn't do this and why did they give in to that and so on and so forth. We weren't living in that room with them for 100 days and what they had to try to fight through to get done. So to say the debates were heated would be an understatement. Combine this with simply humid temperatures in a closed-off space that had no open doors or windows, I'm sure made it a challenge. During the debate, as I mentioned earlier, Franklin advised daily prayer before each session. Thanks to Franklin's wisdom and steady hand, the conflicts remained minimal and the process was able to go forward. He often suggested during an especially tenuous session that the members stop everything and pray. Maybe they should just not have the, what do they call him, not the pastor who opens the sessions in the Senate, the chaplain of the Senate. Maybe they ought to just keep that guy around and say in the middle of every fight and filibuster, why don't we pray?
Right.
Get this guy out of his office if he's got an office. I guess I should have done it. As I look back on it, I probably should have. I got a letter 7 or 8 years ago, I suppose, to say, come to Indianapolis, we want you to open the session in prayer of the House or whatever it was. And I wanted to go, I don't know if you've ever heard Tony Evans, when they said, come and pray, but you can't name the name of Jesus. He tells it's humorous, but it is atypical. Tony Evans said, they've said to me, can't pray in Jesus, but they've convened it. And he said, he goes through this, try to Google that. Of course, he doesn't pay any attention to it, but he does it in such diplomatic ways. So anyway, I thought, if you're not going to let me pray in Jesus' name, there's not much sense in me coming. If you want me to give some kind of nebulous, oh God in the heavens, celestial one, I'm probably not your man. Anyway, his strong emphasis on fundamental points of religious belief was recognized and respected by the other founders. They include, there exists a creator who made all things and God should be worshiped for it. The creator revealed a moral code of behavior that distinguished between right and wrong. Again, that's clear. We've talked about that over and over again in the early weeks of this. The creator holds man accountable for the way he treats others. There's life beyond this one, and man will be judged in the next life based upon what he did in this one. All again, if you'll read through the Constitution, you'll see it, and we'll try to spend 1 week, or at least part of 1 week before we wrap all this up, dealing with largely the Old Testament passages from which they derive this. Going back to British common law, which much of this came from, and then British common law found their roots in the Deuteronomy and other places in the Old Testament in terms of law. Okay, got 10 minutes early. Woo-hoo.
Covered all those pages.
All those pages. You didn't think I could do it, did you? Say, we know you preachers. Don't tell me you're going to be brief. I laugh every time I hear preachers. Well, I'm just a brief message this morning. Why do you say that? Why do you say that? Let's pray. Father, thank you, Lord. Lord, thank you for men that really did risk their lives. Not just their livelihoods. They did that. Many of them lost their livelihoods, but risked their lives. That we could have a nation of freedom, and we thank you for that, Father. May we live lives worthy of that great gift and privilege signed to us because of living in this great democratic republic. May we never lose it. As Franklin told that woman, it is a republic if you can keep it. May we keep it. May we be great believers first and foremost, but may we be great believers who are great citizens of this republic, who love you first and foremost and never get that out of balance, loving a nation more than we love you. May we love you first and foremost and then love our nation in accordance with that and be great citizens of it. And the greatest citizens we can be of it, Father, is to win people to Jesus Christ and then make them fully devoted followers of your Son, Jesus. Thank you for it, Father. May we be open vessels over the course of these next few days, any day, but certainly before we gather again on Sunday, to be a tool in your hand to pray for the sick, give encouragement, draw somebody into the net that is the life and walk of Jesus Christ. Be, again, passionate followers of Jesus that people can see, readily see, for the glory of your Son, Jesus. Amen. See you Sunday or Saturday night in Aurora.
That's right.